Before we begin, do you have a theory about this case or a story of your own? Leave a message on our socials. Our handles are all just Nightwatch Files without the space, or head over to nightwatchfiles.com to find them all in one place. Your insights might be featured in a future episode. I'm Harper Finley, and this is Nightwatch Files. Quick note, if you enjoy the show and want to support it continuing, we have a Patreon that goes for just $3 a month, which is less than a coffee. You'll get ad-free access to every episode, and your support helps us add more perks in the future. Whether you want to help keep the show going or just prefer listening without ads, you can find the link in the episode description. Now, let's get into today's case. On the night of June 17, 1860, Elizabeth Packard couldn't sleep. Around midnight, she crept out of bed in her locked nursery room and peered through the darkness. There, she saw her husband moving silently through the house, searching through her trunks, careful not to make a sound. She knew then that arrangements were being made to carry her off somewhere. The next morning, men would come to the door. Her children would watch as she was forced onto a train, beginning a 200-mile journey that would last not hours, but years. The crowd of supporters at the station would do nothing to stop it. No sheriff's warrant existed, though they were told otherwise. No crime had been committed, though she would lose her freedom. Elizabeth Packard's offense was simple. She had dared to think for herself. What followed would become one of the most extraordinary legal battles of the 19th century. A fight that would expose the dark machinery used to silence women who refused to conform and ultimately change the laws of an entire nation. But on that June morning in 1860, as the train pulled away from the station, Elizabeth had no way of knowing if she would ever see her home or her children again. Elizabeth Parsons Ware was born in 1816. She received what was described as a thorough scientific education, an unusual achievement for a woman of her time. Her intellect and capabilities led to a remarkable teaching career. By 19, she had become principal of Randolph College in Massachusetts, an institution known for employing only the best classical educators. But on February 6, 1836, at that same age of 19, Elizabeth's father, Samuel Ware, had her committed to the state lunatic hospital in Worcester, Massachusetts. The reason given was mental labor, the strain of her demanding work as a school principal. This diagnosis reflected the medical beliefs of the era. Doctors maintained that women who pursued intellectual work were susceptible to derangements of the nervous system. The prevailing theory held that women's minds had a limited capacity to comprehend subjects, and attempting to exceed this capacity would lead to mental breakdown. A visitor to an all-female school in 1858 would later remark that the teachers were training young girls for the lunatic asylum. This medicalization of female behavior served as a mechanism to police women who stepped outside their prescribed gender roles: home and children for women, work, and intellect for men. Other common reasons for committing women to asylums included novel reading. Doctors believed those who engaged in this pernicious habit lived a dreamy kind of existence, so nearly allied to insanity that the slightest exciting cause would be sufficient to derange them. Beyond her supposed overuse of her brain, doctors at the Worcester Asylum were concerned with Elizabeth's irregular menstrual cycle, which was noted on her admittance form. In the 19th century, medical theory held that women's menstrual cycles made them prone to madness, a belief dating back to ancient Greece and the concept of a wandering womb causing hysteria. Every stage of a woman's reproductive life was viewed as a potential threat to her mental stability. Elizabeth maintained a different account of her first commitment. She insisted that her father had very needlessly and unkindly placed her in the asylum after she became physically ill with what was then called brain fever. likely meningitis or encephalitis by modern medical understanding. She claimed her mind recovered the moment she recovered from the physical illness and its treatment, which had included what she considered excessive bleeding. Her medical records appear to support her version of events. While most patients remained in the asylum for months or years, Elizabeth was released after just 6 weeks. This first experience in an asylum would not be her last. Theophilus Packard was born around 1802. He worked as a preacher and had been a professional colleague of Elizabeth's father, Samuel Ware, for many years. Elizabeth had known him since she was about 10 years old, around 1826. His own diary entries from before his marriage provide insight into his character. He described himself as having unusual timidity when it came to public speaking, a notation he made as early as August 1818, when he was just a teenager. His outlook on life was grim. In a diary entry from March 1, 1829, he wrote, "This Sabbath is the commencement of spring. Rapidly do the seasons revolve. The springtime of life is fast spending. Soon the period of death will arrive." He preferred rural life, noting in April 1834 his belief that there was more ostentation, pride, and vice in cities than in country towns. A December 1832 diary entry revealed a core aspect of his philosophy. Self-interest is a powerful principle of action. Theophilus was deeply devout. His faith centered on a God he viewed as a distant tyrant who dispensed mercy so sparingly and secretly that one never quite knew if one had done enough to be saved. He believed everyone was damned unless they found his specific God, a belief that extended to himself. In his prayers, he used to tell God what an awful bad man he was. The courtship between Elizabeth and Theophilus has been described as clumsy and awkward. Throughout this period, Elizabeth harbored significant reservations about her fiancé, who was 15 years her senior. She feared that he did not seem to love her much, a feeling that caused considerable anxiety about their future together. Despite these misgivings, Elizabeth was an obedient daughter of her era. She later stated that she married to please her father. Their wedding took place in 1839. Elizabeth was 22, Theophilus was 37. Elizabeth entered the marriage with a sense of duty and optimism, committing herself to her new husband with all the trusting confidence of woman. Having been raised to be a silent listener, she initially accepted that her preacher husband would be the sole voice in their marriage. Her primary goal was his happiness. "To make him happy was the height of my ambition," she wrote. "That's all I wanted, to make my husband shine inside and out." In 1848, the first Women's Rights Convention was held in Seneca Falls, New York. The event ignited a national conversation about the rights of women. Elizabeth Packard took part in this conversation. Her husband participated less willingly. This marked a significant turning point in their marriage. Inspired by the movement, Elizabeth began to challenge traditional roles. She started to argue that wives are not mere things. They are a part of society. This stood in stark contrast to Theophilus's belief that a woman has no rights that a man is bound to respect. Their differing views led to countless warm discussions. Elizabeth, who possessed a rare command of language, consistently triumphed in these arguments. But her intellectual victories came at a cost. She sensed that her husband felt a jealousy, lest she outshine him. Theophilus, feeling stung by his wife's superior arguments, began recording her perceived slights in his diary. He complained that his wife had become unfavorably affected by the tone of society, and zealously espoused almost all new notions and wild vagaries that came along. The women's rights movement inspired a realization in Elizabeth. "I, though a woman, have just as good a right to my opinion as my husband has to his." She declared, "I have got a mind of my own, and a will too, and I will think and act as I please." This newfound independence was unacceptable to Theophilus. The scriptural passage, "Wives, obey your husbands," became frequently quoted in their home. But Elizabeth was no longer the silent listener she had been raised to be. She felt that her husband might, with equal justice, require her to subject her ability to breathe, to sneeze, or to cough to his dictation, as to require the subjugation of her rights to think and act as her own conscience dictates. Theophilus's response was telling. He did not engage with her ideas or encourage her independence. Instead, he began to suggest that her mind was failing. He wrote that he had sad reason to fear his wife's mind was getting out of order. She was becoming insane on the subject of women's rights. In 1855, the Packard family moved west to Illinois. The change from Shelburne, Massachusetts, defined by mountains and trees, to the open prairies of the Midwest had a profound effect on Elizabeth. The wide skies and open landscapes seemed to represent endless possibilities. Living in this new environment, Elizabeth's intellectual and personal growth continued to flourish. Her differences with Theophilus only increased after the move. She declared, "No man shall ever rule me, for I ain't a brute, made without reason. I'm a human being, made with reason, to rule myself with." Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. The first half of 1860 brought escalating conflict to the Packard household. The tensions that had been building for years were about to reach their breaking point. The catalyst was a Bible class run by Theophilus's Presbyterian Church. Elizabeth began attending the classes, which were partly intended to persuade the congregation to adopt a recent switch from New School to the more conservative Old School doctrines. Instead of conforming, Elizabeth challenged her husband's theological positions and encouraged her classmates to think critically. She possessed what was described as a rare command of language and an irresistible magnetism. She easily eclipsed her husband in these discussions. Though initially reticent, she grew more confident over the weeks, voluntarily reading her essays aloud. To prevent misrepresentation of her views, she made a point of putting all her statements into written form. Theophilus was horrified by her public dissent. He asked her to stop attending the class and insisted she tell the congregation it was her choice to leave. She refused. "But dear, it is not my choice," she told him truthfully. Having begun to find her voice, Elizabeth refused to be silenced or to act the hypocrite by professing to believe what she could not believe. One key point of disagreement was abolition. Elizabeth supported the freedom of slaves, while the new church creed was ambivalent on the issue. Feeling powerless in the face of her eloquence, Theophilus conceived a plan to silence her. He began a concerted campaign to label his wife as insane, thereby discrediting her opinions. During an argument, Theophilus warned Elizabeth, "I shall put you into the asylum." At first, Elizabeth laughed at the threat. She believed she lived in a free country where freedom of religion was sacrosanct. But Theophilus was serious. He began publicly undermining her. In the Bible class, he dismissed her ideas as the result of a diseased brain. He told their neighbors she was suffering from an attack of derangement. His evidence consisted of her acting so different from her former conduct, her strange and unreasonable doings in her verbal and written sayings, and what he saw as the definitive proof, her lack of interest in her husband. Elizabeth was aware of his strategy. She confronted him directly. "Why do you try to injure and destroy my character rather than my opinions?" In May 1860, Elizabeth grew bolder. She made the decision to formally leave her husband's church. "To be false to my honest convictions, I could not be made to do," she stated. Theophilus feared others in the congregation might follow her example. His parishioners sided with their pastor. On May 22, 1860, 39 of them signed a petition to have Elizabeth placed in an insane asylum as speedily as it can be conveniently done. In the days immediately preceding June 18th, Theophilus intensified his efforts, turning their home into a prison. He boarded the shutters of her ground-floor nursery shut and locked her in the room, supposedly to withdraw her from conversation and excitement. Elizabeth knew the real reason was because her sane conduct might betray his falsehoods. He also brought a 23-year-old parishioner, Sarah Rumsey, into their home. Though supposedly a housekeeper, Sarah was a teacher from a wealthy family. Elizabeth knew she was no servant, but a spy. 2 days before her removal, on June 16, 1860, Theophilus summoned parishioners to their parlor for what Elizabeth later called a mock trial of her sanity. Deacon Spring acted as the biased moderator. Elizabeth's son Isaac attended and was devastated by the inevitable verdict of insanity. Her 16-year-old son Isaac was her most staunch defender. He had alerted his older brother Toffee to the situation and secured pledges of help from townspeople who were not members of his father's church. They promised they would intervene if Theophilus tried to have her committed. Before being locked up, Elizabeth had sought legal advice from Mr. Comstock, a lawyer who was also a member of Theophilus's church. He assured her that under Illinois law, an insanity trial before a jury was required for commitment. This gave her a feeling of comparative security. Believing a trial was her only obstacle, she began preparing her Bible class essays as her defense and started sewing a pocket in her underskirt to hide them. On the night of June 17, 1860, Elizabeth was unable to sleep. Around midnight, she crept out of bed and discovered Theophilus noiselessly searching through all her trunks. This confirmed her suspicion that arrangements were being made to carry her off somewhere. On June 18, 1860, Elizabeth Packard was forcibly removed from her home in Manteno, Illinois. A large crowd of supporters had gathered at the train station, but no one intervened to stop her husband from committing her. Deacon Dole falsely told the crowd that a sheriff had a formal warrant and anyone interfering would be arrested. The only person to speak out was her friend, Rebecca Blessing, who cried, "Is there no man in this crowd to protect this woman?" Elizabeth was carried onto the train and began the 200-mile journey to the Jacksonville Insane Asylum. She arrived late that evening, past 8 o'clock. She surveyed the large, 5.5-story hospital with its endless rows of barred windows. She was greeted by the assistant physician, Dr. Tenney, who escorted her to the 7th ward in the original West Wing. The first thing that struck her was the horrid and sickening stench that permeated the area beyond the public reception hall. Due to overcrowding, she was given a tiny private room with a narrow settee bed. That night, she heard the unearthly sounds of cries, screams, and uncanny laughter from the other patients for the first time. On June 19th, the day after her arrival, Elizabeth had her first interview with the asylum's superintendent, Dr. Andrew McFarland. She found him to be a fine-looking gentleman and a true man. During a wide-ranging conversation that touched on religion and politics, Elizabeth felt she had found a feast of reason and a flow of soul. She was so confident that she had demonstrated her sanity that she believed McFarland was fully convinced in his heart that she was not insane before their interview ended. However, her admittance was a foregone conclusion. Theophilus's application had included 2 medical certificates attesting to her insanity. Dr. Christopher Knott cited her derangement of mind on religious matters, as well as her unusual zealousness and strong will. The other, from Dr. Newkirk, a member of her husband's church, cited her incessant talking as evidence of madness. Unbeknownst to her, on that same day, McFarland formally entered her into the asylum's register, recording her as slightly insane, with the attack becoming more decided the past 4 months, a period that directly coincided with her joining the Bible class. When Theophilus left the asylum later that afternoon, he gave her one look of satisfied delight, his face radiant with joy. In the initial weeks of her stay, Elizabeth became what staff called the asylum favorite. McFarland relaxed the rules for her, granting her almost queen-like attention. She was allowed to keep her clothes in her room, borrow books from the library, and was even given her own set of ward keys, permitting her to leave without an attendant. McFarland, in turn, found his new patient a truly interesting study with a fine mind and brilliant imagination, as he wrote to Theophilus on August 11th. In late June, her friends the Blessings visited her from Manteno, bringing a Dr. Shirley who, after conversing with Elizabeth, declared, "She is the sanest person I ever saw." The Blessings informed her of a public indignation meeting planned for June 30th and promised to seek a writ of habeas corpus to secure her release. On July 13th, Theophilus sent a large trunk of her belongings, dashing her hopes for a short stay. Searching through the tangled contents, she found no letters from her children, only a single, devastating note from her daughter Libby. "We are glad to hear you are getting better. Hope you will soon get well." This cemented Elizabeth's fear that Theophilus was teaching the children to despise their mother. Soon after, McFarland offered her a path to liberty, but with one condition: she would have to return to Theophilus as his obedient wife and submit. Elizabeth refused, declaring, "Self-defense forbids it." Instead, she decided to stay at the asylum voluntarily to give the doctor more time to see the truth of her sanity for himself. Through the summer, Elizabeth and McFarland developed a close intellectual relationship, with his visits becoming the greatest pleasure of her asylum experience. However, her trust in him was shattered in late summer when her eldest son, Toffee, came to visit. After he left, Elizabeth happened to be in McFarland's office and saw a letter addressed to her in Toffee's handwriting. McFarland snatched it from her and refused to tell her what it said. From that moment, Elizabeth realized with sadness his word could no longer be trusted. Elizabeth began to watch the doctor more closely, observing his censorship and realizing he was trying to impress upon her mind that she was friendless. In September, after another patient accused her of acting indiscreetly on a swing, she went to McFarland's office to discuss it. During the conversation, he kissed her on the forehead. While she later recalled it as an impulsive act, at the time she worried it might be a stepping stone to insults and felt an imperative necessity of devising some self-defensive armor. This armor came in the form of her writing. She decided to write 2 documents, a formal defense of her sanity and a reproof detailing the abuse and mistreatment of patients she had witnessed, determined that her voice against it would be heard. On October 26, 1860, she presented her defense to Dr. McFarland. In it, she requested an honorable discharge, stated her determination never to return to her husband, and described him as a perverted and unnatural man. She even quoted David's prayer for his persecutors in reference to Theophilus, an act McFarland later described as diabolical and evidence of her madness. When McFarland did not respond to her defense after several days, Elizabeth decided to proceed with her second document. On November 12, 1860, 6 days after Abraham Lincoln was elected president, she presented McFarland with her reproof. In it, she called his principles contrary to reason, to justice, to humanity, and accused him of being incapacitated for his office. She included testimony she had gathered from other patients and staff, and threatened to expose him with the iron pen of the press if he did not repent. McFarland's only emotional reaction came when she mentioned there had been an eyewitness to his kiss. At this, his feelings burst their confinement, and he seemed determined, from that moment, to either rule or ruin her. A few days later, McFarland acted on that determination. He led Elizabeth away from the privileged 7th Ward to a heavy door she had never seen before. He opened it, and a most fetid scent hit her as she was ushered into the asylum's 8th Ward, the Maniacs' Ward, home to the filthy, the suicidal, the raving, and the furious. As the door slammed shut behind her, her status as the asylum favorite was officially and brutally terminated. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. On September 4th, 1862, after more than 2 years of confinement, Elizabeth Packard was granted an in-person meeting with the asylum's Board of Trustees. She dressed carefully for the occasion in a white lawn dress with sky blue trimmings and a tasteful headdress. Dr. Andrew McFarland escorted her to the meeting, where her husband, Theophilus, had already presented his case protesting her discharge. Given just 10 minutes to speak, Elizabeth read from a prepared document that McFarland had previously reviewed. She then surprised everyone by producing a second appeal, which she had secretly written on torn-out pages from a ward Bible, and asked for permission to read it. The trustees agreed, and for nearly 50 minutes, Elizabeth eloquently exposed what she called the foul conspiracy and wicked plot that had led to her imprisonment for her religious beliefs. She argued against her husband's claim that her children's welfare demanded her confinement, questioning his right to dictate her beliefs and challenging the double standard that would see her institutionalized for making the same demands of him. Her presentation was met with a positive reaction from the trustees, who even laughed at her witty analogies. After she spoke, McFarland was asked for his opinion. In a stunning reversal, he recommended her discharge. However, the trustees made an unusual decision. Citing the remonstrance from her husband, father, brothers, and other relatives, they decided to postpone the final consideration of her case until their next meeting in December. Elizabeth interpreted this deferment as good news. She believed the trustees needed time to figure out how to grant her unprecedented request to be released as an independent woman, not back into her husband's care. Convinced they now saw the injustice of her imprisonment, she fully expected to be discharged at the next meeting and began to dream of being home with her children for Christmas. Believing the tide had turned, she felt a complete victory was at hand. The day after the meeting, Dr. McFarland, seemingly pleased with her presentation, encouraged her to write down her story. He offered to pay to have it printed and told her, "Write what you please." This grant of spiritual liberty was something no man had ever allowed her before, and it fundamentally shifted her perception of the doctor. What began as a plan to print her appeal to the trustees quickly expanded into a grander vision for a book. Elizabeth felt her hitherto prison-bound intellect rapidly expand as she conceived of a work that would explore women's rights, legislative reform, and her personal story. This book, which she titled The Great Drama, became her single anchor and her primary hope for securing financial independence and ultimately her freedom. McFarland gave her an unlimited supply of paper and instructed attendants not to disturb her. For 6 weeks, she wrote in a stream of consciousness, her pen leaping from topic to topic. The work was a mix of allegory, biography, and political appeal, with passionate calls for women's rights, rights for the mentally ill, and the emancipation of African Americans and Native Americans. The writing process brought her a delightful feeling of satisfaction, and she believed her book was a great battery that would make her financially independent and secure her safety from her husband. During this period, her 2 eldest sons, Toffee and Isaac, visited her, further boosting her spirits. They brought news that their father had resigned from his ministry in Manteno in July 1862 and now lived on charity. They also shared a letter from Theophilus in which he expressed fear that he should not be able to keep his mother much longer in the asylum. This confirmed Elizabeth's belief that her release in December was a certainty. By mid-October, she had completed a manuscript of 2,500 pages. The book caused a universal sensation throughout the hospital, with copied pages secretly passed between wards, inspiring other patients to believe in a better world. On December 3, 1862, the trustees met again. Elizabeth, full of hope, waited all day for the verdict. Instead of freedom, McFarland delivered devastating news. Her release had been indefinitely postponed. The trustees had sided with her husband and male relatives, who continued to protest her discharge. The decision plunged Elizabeth into the gulf of black despair. She felt desolate and forsaken and believed there was no hope of her ever receiving justice at their hands. Thoughts of her children became agonizing, and she feared she would die a prisoner in her cell. By the new year, Elizabeth, feeling desperate, concluded that her only hope lay in getting her book published. But McFarland appeared to be dragging his heels on his promise to fund the printing. On January 19, 1863, she made what she later called a dark exchange. She wrote McFarland a secret letter, her last, her only hope, in which she offered him her heart and soul in the afterlife in exchange for his help. She wrote, "To such a one alone can I entrust the key with which to unlock the fountain of conjugal love within me. This key I entrust to you, Dr. McFarland. I shall regard the act on my part as an engagement sealed to be yours alone, until death part us. I must not love your person, so long as that love is justly claimed by another woman, your legal wife. She asked him only to issue a small first edition of her first volume. When he read the letter, McFarland offered his hand, and with a slight pressure, he seemed to accept her terms. However, when he still took no action, she wrote him another note threatening to publish a second, secret book she called The Exposure. McFarland retaliated by briefly putting her in solitary confinement and confiscating the entire manuscript of the great drama. Believing he was bound by their secret deal, Elizabeth remained confident he would not destroy it. 3 weeks later, he returned the papers with an apology. Around this time, Elizabeth received unsettling news from her cousin, Angeline Field. Theophilus, disturbed by the possibility of her release, had found another asylum willing to take her, the State Lunatic Hospital in Northampton, Massachusetts. This asylum would accept her as a hopeless case, where she could be imprisoned for life. This new threat filled her with fear as the next trustees' meeting on March 4, 1863, approached. At this meeting, the trustees made another decision. Elizabeth was ordered to be discharged after June 19, 1863. The reason given was that her case was now considered incurable. Faced with the prospect of being handed over to Theophilus and taken to Northampton, Elizabeth protested vehemently, now feeling safer inside the asylum. Elizabeth now viewed Jacksonville's walls as a refuge of safety. Her eldest son, Toffee, had recently turned 21, and she arranged for him to pay for her to stay at the asylum as a boarder, believing this changed her legal status and would protect her from Theophilus. For the first time in years, she felt free enough to leave the hospital grounds, taking a walk into Jacksonville with Toffee in May. She was unaware, however, that McFarland was actively colluding with her husband. On May 5, 1863, he issued a formal certificate to Theophilus stating that Elizabeth's disease was not cured and that he had no question of her insanity. This certificate was all Theophilus needed to get a second one and commit her to Northampton without a trial. On June 18, 1863, exactly 3 years after her commitment, Elizabeth's time was up. McFarland was away, and his assistant, Dr. Tenney, with 2 other men, burst into her room. Despite her protests that she had a right to herself, she was forcibly carried from her room, out of the asylum, and placed in a carriage where Theophilus was waiting. As she was driven away, she was certain her husband was taking her to the asylum in Northampton. For life. The journey, however, ended late that night in the town of Tonopah, Illinois. When the train stopped, a terrified Elizabeth followed her husband off the car, bracing for the worst. Instead of another asylum, she stepped into the arms of her dearest friend, her cousin Angeline, who had come to take her to the safety of her home in Granville. The year 1864 began with Elizabeth Packard imprisoned in her own home by her husband Theophilus, who planned to commit her to an asylum in Northampton, Massachusetts for life. However, on Tuesday, January 12, 1864, her friends secured a writ of habeas corpus, compelling Theophilus to bring Elizabeth before Judge Charles R. Starr in Kankakee for a hearing on the legality of her confinement. This legal maneuver was possible only because she was imprisoned at home. Had she already been in the Northampton Asylum, the commitment would have been legal and habeas corpus could not have been used. Elizabeth had orchestrated this situation months earlier by stealing and hiding the house keys, ensuring Theophilus would lock her up securely enough to justify the writ. The trial began that same day, amid a massive crowd that had gathered in Elizabeth's support. Theophilus, represented by lawyers Thomas Bonfield and Mason Loomis, denied unlawfully imprisoning his wife, but admitted to exercising a slight necessary restraint over her on account of her insanity. In a highly unusual move for a habeas corpus case, Judge Starr ordered Theophilus to prove this claim before a jury of 12 men. The prosecution's case for Elizabeth's insanity quickly unraveled. Dr. Christopher Knott, who had issued an insanity certificate in 1860, testified that he only ever considered her a monomaniac on religion, and that 3/4 of the religious community are insane in the same manner. He added that confinement would have made her worse, and that she had only needed rest. Dr. J.W. Brown, who had examined Elizabeth while posing as a sewing machine salesman, declared her hopelessly insane. However, under cross-examination by Elizabeth's lawyer, Stephen Moore, his reasons were ridiculed by the courtroom. They included her aversion to being called insane, her claim to be the personification of the Holy Ghost, and her use of complex theological language. Dr. Joseph Way, another physician hired by Theophilus, backed away from his initial diagnosis, stating, "I would not swear now that she was insane." Members of Theophilus's church, including Deacon Abijah Dole and Sybil Dole, testified that Elizabeth was crazy because her religious ideas were wrong. She was filled with spite toward Mr. Packard, and she asserted herself by declaring she would talk what and when she had a mind to. A dramatic moment occurred when Sybil Dole brought Elizabeth's daughter, Libby, into the courtroom. The girl ran to her mother and threw her arms around her, only for Sybil to snatch her away, hissing, "Come away from that woman. She is not fit to take care of you." The incident caused quite a stir and moved many in the crowd to tears. Fearing the trial was going against him, Theophilus's lawyer tried to get it adjourned for 10 days to allow Dr. Andrew McFarland to testify. When the judge refused, the prosecution was permitted to read McFarland's damning certificate and letters to the jury, in which he stated he had no question of Elizabeth's insanity and that she was incurable. In her defense, Elizabeth was permitted to read one of her Bible class essays to the jury, which the prosecution had cited as evidence of her madness. Her articulate and reasonable performance was met with a murmur of applause from the courtroom. Her final witness, Dr. Alexander Duncanson, a physician and dissenting Presbyterian clergyman, delivered a powerful testimony. He declared Elizabeth not only sane but the most intelligent lady he had talked with in many years, and affirmed that her theological views were ancient dogmas entertained by many of the nation's most eminent men. On the evening of Monday, January 18, 1864, after 7 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict: sane. The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause. Judge Starr officially ordered that Elizabeth be relieved of all restraint incompatible with her condition as a sane woman. Elizabeth's victory was immediately overshadowed by a devastating blow. As she prepared to return home to her children, she was handed a letter from Theophilus. Warned of mob violence against him, he had fled the state for Massachusetts, taking their 3 youngest children, Libby, George, and Arthur, with him. When Elizabeth rushed back to Manteno, she found her home stripped of every piece of furniture and rented to a stranger. At 47 years of age, she found herself homeless, penniless, and childless. When she consulted her lawyers, they explained the legal doctrine of coverture. As a married woman, she had no legal existence and therefore no right to her property, her earnings, or her children. On the principle of common law, they told her, whatever is yours is his, your property is his, your earnings are his, your children are his, and you are his. Her only hope of regaining custody was to get a divorce, a path her lawyers, friends, and the press all urged her to take. On February 8, 1864, she filed for divorce, citing repeated and extreme cruelty. While her legal status was in limbo, Elizabeth faced a public relations war. Starting on January 29th, Dr. McFarland and Theophilus launched a media campaign to discredit the verdict. In a letter published in the Chicago Tribune on February 4th, McFarland reiterated his belief that Elizabeth was insane. On February 5th, Theophilus wrote to his local Massachusetts paper blasting the sham trial. On March 12th, the Chicago Tribune sided with them, declaring Elizabeth was afflicted with a well-defined species of monomania, and that the public should give this painful subject no further thought. Recognizing she needed to support herself and fight back, Elizabeth decided to become her own protector and pursue a career as a writer. On March 17, 1864, she traveled to Chicago, having borrowed $10 from friends. There, she arranged for the printing of 2,000 copies of a 32-page pamphlet containing her 1860 reproof to Dr. McFarland. To fund the publication of her larger book, she devised a crowdfunding plan, traveling across Illinois to sell advance purchase tickets for 50 cents each. On March 23rd, she placed an advertisement in the Chicago Tribune appealing to the public for support, explaining she had been left penniless by the desertion of her husband. Her highly public, independent work was scandalous for the era. Her own son, Toffee, wrote to his father on March 29th, begging him to get her into proper keeping. In April 1864, Elizabeth made a pivotal decision. When her divorce case came to court, she abandoned the proceedings. She realized a divorce would only save herself, whereas changing the discriminatory laws could save thousands of other married women. She also understood that remaining a married woman in legal peril made her a more compelling advocate for reform. Being in the position of a married woman, she explained, I was in imminent danger of being wronged still further, unless the politicians helped me. In May 1864, having raised $700 through her own efforts, Elizabeth self-published her first book, The Exposure. An anthology of her asylum writings, it concluded with an impassioned appeal to the government for protection, asking for laws that would allow a married woman to stand on the same platform as a married man. The book was an immediate success. A second edition was on sale by June 18, 1864, and by the end of the year, she had sold $3,000 worth of books, finally achieving financial independence. With this, Elizabeth Packard, the housewife, was reborn as a political campaigner. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. Having established herself as a financially independent author and activist in 1864, Elizabeth Packard began her work of reforming the laws in 1865. Elizabeth began her campaign in Massachusetts, the state where her husband Theophilus had fled with their 3 youngest children. She feared that without a change to the state's commitment law, which was nearly identical to the old Illinois law, another kidnapping was inevitable for her. She enlisted the help of Samuel Sewall, a lawyer and passionate advocate for women's rights, who taught her the tricks of her new trade. Together, they lobbied the legislature, and Elizabeth appeared in person before a joint special committee. She also pounded the streets of Boston to gather signatures for a petition, fearlessly canvassing masculine spaces like the Custom House and Navy Yard. On May 16, 1865, the Massachusetts legislature amended its insanity law, making secret frame-ups more difficult by requiring that interested persons be informed of a commitment. This victory gave Elizabeth immense confidence. On February 16, 1865, a new law was passed in Illinois that allowed all persons accused of insanity, including married women, to have a jury trial before being committed to an asylum. The extensive coverage of Elizabeth's own case undoubtedly inspired these reforms. By the end of the year, Elizabeth's literary career was also flourishing. By January 1865, an additional 6,000 copies of her first book, The Exposure, were printed in Boston. With the Illinois General Assembly not sitting in 1866, Elizabeth took her campaign to Connecticut. She launched an ambitious campaign to overturn the legal doctrine of coverture, proposing a bill that would allow a married woman to retain the same legal existence and receive the same legal protection of her rights as does a man. This was a trial run for reforms she hoped to pass in Illinois and Massachusetts, which would ultimately allow her to sue for custody of her children. Despite winning the support of hundreds of men, the Judiciary Committee ultimately found it inexpedient to make such radical changes at the present time, and the bill failed. In March 1866, Elizabeth published her second book, Marital Power Exemplified. This slim volume focused more directly on married women's rights and was inspired by the success of Uncle Tom's Cabin in swaying public opinion. The book was another hit, further solidifying her financial independence and providing her a platform for her political work. The year 1867 was a period of intense and consequential activity for Elizabeth, as she returned to Illinois to secure justice for the women still in the Jacksonville Asylum. In January, Elizabeth arrived in Springfield, the state capital, and went to the governor's mansion to meet with Governor Richard J. Oglesby. Though he was initially dismissive due to his personal friendship with Dr. McFarland, Elizabeth presented him with a petition signed by 36 influential men, which changed his tone and secured her a meeting. The governor introduced her to legislators who helped her draft a new personal liberty bill. Elizabeth successfully insisted that the bill include penalties for doctors who admitted patients without a trial and a 60-day deadline for current inmates to be granted a trial. Dr. McFarland campaigned aggressively against the bill, meeting personally with politicians to discredit Elizabeth and urge them to repeal the 1865 law. Elizabeth countered by lobbying politicians in their boarding house parlors, using a clever strategy of flattery and appealing to their sense of manly duty. On February 12th, Elizabeth was invited to address the Illinois General Assembly. In a powerful speech, she argued for her bill, detailed the injustices of the current system, and strongly hinted that a full investigation into the asylum was necessary. Her address was a sensation. On March 5th, Governor Oglesby signed the bill into law. It became widely known as Packard's Law. Elizabeth's speech had an immediate impact, prompting an unannounced legislative visit to the Jacksonville Asylum the very next day. Several legislators who had been briefed by Elizabeth visited her friends, Sarah Menard and Maria Chapman, and left convinced of the injustice of their confinement. Despite a favorable report from the Senate Finance Committee on February 23rd, the public outcry fueled by Elizabeth's campaign and newspaper articles detailing horrible revelations of abuse led to the appointment of a special joint committee to investigate the asylum on February 26th. The State Register credited the committee's formation mainly to the efforts of Mrs. Packard. The committee, chaired by the highly respected General Allen C. Fuller, was given the power to examine witnesses under oath. The committee began its work in May 1867. On June 6th, Elizabeth was called to testify. She spoke for nearly 7 hours, detailing her commitment, the censorship, the violence she witnessed, and McFarland's cruelty. In a dramatic turn, McFarland, who was present to cross-examine her, publicly produced and had read aloud her secret love letter from January 19, 1863. The committee was shocked, viewing it as either a sign of a diseased and disordered intellect or a degrading invitation of illicit intercourse. The next day, Elizabeth gave a powerful written explanation, framing the letter as a desperate but justifiable act of self-defense. The investigation continued through the fall, hearing from 22 former patients and numerous employees who corroborated the claims of widespread abuse. On December 4th, General Fuller read the committee's final report to the hospital's trustees. The report was damning. It confirmed that patients had been unjustly committed in violation of the law, that McFarland's classification of patients was fundamentally wrong, and that his rule of force has too often usurped the law of love. It unanimously recommended an immediate change in the office of superintendent, that Dr. McFarland be fired. The trustees were enraged and refused to act on the recommendation. Governor Oglesby, McFarland's friend, agreed to suppress the report, planning to sit on it for over a year until the next General Assembly convened in 1869. On December 7th, in a stunning move, General Fuller leaked the entire report to the Chicago Tribune. Its publication caused a profound sensation across the country and even in Europe, as the public learned of the horrific abuse and mismanagement at the hospital. For Elizabeth, it was total vindication, as the report confirmed the truth of all her charges against the superintendent. The year 1869 marked a pivotal victory for Elizabeth in her long fight to be reunited with her children. With her 3 eldest sons, Toffee, Isaac, and now the lawyer Samuel, publicly supporting her, she traveled to Boston to launch a custody suit. By this time, she had become a financially independent businesswoman, owning 2 houses and possessing some $10,000 in savings. Her husband Theophilus, in contrast, had not held a permanent pastorship since 1865 and was living on charity. On May 24, 1869, before the custody case could proceed, Theophilus's lawyer, seeing which way the legal and public winds were blowing, advised him to surrender. The 3 youngest children, Libby, George, and Arthur, wrote to Elizabeth stating, "We will gladly accept of your offer to go out and live with you in Chicago." Elizabeth replied, "My fond heart is filled with joy." For her, the mother's battle was fought, and the victory won. In the summer of 1869, Elizabeth established a new home for her family at 1497 Prairie Avenue, then Chicago's finest residential area. In a remarkable reunion, all 6 of her children came to live with her. Theophilus also moved to Chicago to be near them, and relations between the estranged husband and wife became cordial though distant. Elizabeth allowed him to visit the children, but she treated him as a stranger gentleman. On June 8, 1870, Dr. Andrew McFarland, after years of public pressure following the investigating committee's report, finally resigned from his post as superintendent of the Jacksonville Asylum. In a pattern that had become familiar, double the usual number of patients were discharged just before his departure. Instead of returning to a quiet domestic life as she had once planned, Elizabeth, changed by her experiences, chose to dedicate her undivided energies to the great work of reformation. For the next 3 decades, Elizabeth campaigned tirelessly across the country. She proved to be a remarkably successful and persistent political force. By her own count, she was responsible for the passage of 34 bills in 24 states, fighting for both women's rights and the rights of the mentally ill. One of her most significant and lasting achievements was securing the postal rights of patients, guaranteeing them uncensored access to mail, a reform directly inspired by her own experience with McFarland's censorship. These bills often bore her name, with headlines marking the passing of Packard's Law. She also successfully campaigned for the establishment of independent asylum inspection bodies, sometimes insisting that a female inspector be included. In 1878, Elizabeth made a concerted effort to reclaim her public narrative. She published The Mystic Key, a book intended to explain the context of her controversial love letter to Dr. McFarland, which she called the greatest obstacle to her work. That same year, having finally raised enough capital, she published her magnum opus, The Great Drama, the book she had written in the asylum. She dedicated it to my beloved sisters, the married women of America. Throughout her career, she was relentlessly attacked by opponents who labeled her a half-cured lunatic and used her letter to besmirch her virtue. McFarland himself remained her most terrible antagonist, reportedly making a special trip to Washington, D.C. to inform committee members of her insanity when she was lobbying President Grant for a federal postal rights bill, which subsequently failed to pass. Theophilus never held a permanent pastorship after 1865. He spent his final years living a quiet, solitary life in his sister Sybil's house, his world reduced to a single room in an echo of the confinement he had forced on Elizabeth. He died in December 1885 at the age of 83. A late diary entry reads, "I acknowledge the justice of God in this great calamity, and hope that He in mercy is overruling it for my spiritual welfare." Dr. McFarland's reputation and career blossomed after leaving the state hospital. He became incredibly wealthy and opened a successful private asylum called Oak Lawn. He was consulted on the high-profile insanity cases of President Garfield's assassin and Mary Todd Lincoln. On November 22, 1891, suffering from a fatal brain inflammation and depression, he died by suicide, hanging himself in a vacant room in his asylum. He was 76. His inquest cited temporary mental aberration. Elizabeth's sons scattered across the country and pursued various careers, with Samuel becoming a successful lawyer and advocate for reform, inspired by his mother. Tragically, her daughter Libby suffered a lifelong struggle with mental illness, which the family attributed to the intense stress she endured as a child after her mother's commitment. Elizabeth stopped her reform work for 3 years to care for Libby full-time. When Libby was later committed to an asylum in California by her husband, Elizabeth rescued her and cared for her personally at her son Toffee's house. Libby eventually died in an asylum at the age of 51. Elizabeth outlived both of the men who had tried to silence her. She lived with her son Toffee in California while caring for Libby. In July 1897, she traveled with her daughter to Chicago. Less than a week later, she was rushed to the hospital. On July 25, 1897, Elizabeth Packard died from a strangulated hernia at the age of 80. Her death was reported across the country, with obituaries mourning the loss of the wise friend of the insane and comparing her influence to that of Harriet Beecher Stowe. Her funeral was private, and she was buried in Rose Hill Cemetery next to her son George. Her gravestone bears a single word: Mother.